Deosai National Park is a place that very few people have the privilege to travel to. Located in northern Pakistan, it is extremely remote, very difficult to access, and you need special vehicles to travel here. However, if you go through all the effort, you will be rewarded with exceptional beauty and a little slice of paradise here in the Himalayas. If you're new here, hi, my name is Laura and I've been traveling all over the world for the past few years. In this channel, I share lots of travel vlogs, hidden gems and travel information videos, so make sure you subscribe if you want more of that. But for now, let's go back into the video. My journey to Deosai National Park starts in Skardu, so while Deosai is accessible from other areas, I recommend Skardu especially if you're an international tourist for several reasons. Firstly, Skardu has an international airport, so there are daily flights from Islamabad and also some flights from Lahore which are very short and very affordable as well. And Pakistan International Airlines is actually going to start operating a flight from Skardu to Abu Dhabi, so it is a very easy place to access within Gilgit-Baltistan, so this is one reason I recommend if you want to go to Deosai that you start from Skardu. And the second reason is that Skardu has a lot more to see besides Deosai, so you can go to places like Lower Kachura Lake or the Katpana Cold Desert, or just enjoy the views of the valley and spend a few days here. So if you want to know a bit more about Skardu, make sure you watch my last YouTube video where I talk a little bit more about this place and I show you around. But back to Deosai, if you want to get to Deosai from Skardu or from whichever other place you're starting your journey in, you have to go on a jeep. The roads in Deosai and the roads to get to Deosai in the first place are not of great quality, they're not paved, and yeah, they're not great. So you definitely need a sturdy vehicle to get around here. I made it to Deosai National Park and this place is absolutely incredible. We've seen very little of it so far, but I already love it, to be honest. And I feel very, very grateful to be here because this place is very remote and it's very inaccessible, and you can only access it in the summer. So this park is closed for most of the year because the roads here aren't accessible during the winter. So I feel so privileged and so lucky to be in this wonderful place. Deosai Plains are the second highest plains in the world, only after the Tibetan Plateau. So right now I'm at an altitude of about 4,000 meters, but it can go even higher than this. And the park was established in 1993 to protect the Himalayan brown bear. So back in 1993, there were only 19 bears in this whole park, which is 3,000 square kilometers. And I think as of 2022, there are 78. And there's also lots of other animals. So there's marmots, there's ibex, there's deer, there's Himalayan wolves, and a few birds. So if we're lucky, we'll be able to see some, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I'm definitely not expecting to see wildlife. It would be very cool if I got to see something, but honestly, I'm here for the views. So Deosai means the land of the giants in Urdu, which is the main language spoken here in Pakistan, and this name fits this place so perfectly. The land of the giants, it's just such a good name. Something that really caught my attention when I was in Deosai was that all of these mountains in the distance, they seem so small, but they're all over 5,000 meters high, and the reason they seem so tiny is because you're also super high when you're in Deosai. Like, Deosai is at an average elevation of 4,114 meters or 13,497 feet. So crazy high. That's a crazy high altitude. And it makes these huge mountains seem tiny. Something else I noticed is that at this elevation, the sky somehow seems bluer and the clouds seem closer to you, like you do feel closer to the clouds, which was a very weird sensation, and maybe it's got to do something with the low oxygen levels here, the low carbon dioxide levels, or maybe not, I don't know, but whatever the reason, it seems like you're closer to the sky here. However, there is another name for Deosai, so the Balti people who are native to the region call this place Gabiarsa, and I hope I pronounced that right, but Gabiarsa means a summer's place, because Deosai is only accessible in summer. Like I said, it is an extremely remote place, extremely difficult to access, And the plateau's environment is characterized by extreme cold, with low atmospheric pressure, low oxygen, low carbon dioxide levels, aridity, and intense and rapid solar ultraviolet radiation. So definitely a difficult place to live in. Not to mention, of course, the altitude, which I mentioned before, is at an average of around 4,100 meters, but it can go as low as 3,500 and as high as 5,200 meters above sea level. During the winter, it snows pretty heavily in Deosai, so the locals don't come up here, and of course the jeeps can't either because of the snow and the ice. So the park closes to tourists in October, and it remains closed until April. It is generally recommended that you try to visit in June or July because the park sometimes closes because of bad weather, so it's a little bit of a risk to try to visit in the spring or in the fall because the park might close and you might not get to go. But if you get the chance, I really recommend that you try visiting in the spring. I personally visited in August, but I would love to try to go in the spring someday because in the spring, Deosai is covered with wildflowers. There are wildflowers everywhere and so many butterflies, and there's snow and the mountains in the distance. And I can only imagine how beautiful that must be. And Deosai is spectacular no matter the time of the year. Like I said, I visited in August and it was gorgeous. Like, I have been to over 20 countries at this point, and Deosai is very clearly a highlight for me. It definitely stands out as one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been to. So even if you cannot visit in spring and you can only visit in summer, definitely still come here. During the summer, the locals also come up here with their cattle, with their goats, their sheep, their yaks, and they use this as pastures for their animals. So for example, we stopped by this river to take some photos and to enjoy the views, and we also came across this herd of goats, which I thought was really cool. And we also saw some yaks, or at least we think that they're yaks. Those animals over there, like that one right there, and those I think are yaks. I'm not entirely sure because I've never seen a yak. I've eaten some, but I've never seen one, but they have these huge horns, so I do think that they're yaks. And those peaks right there, they're so gorgeous. Imagine this place a bit earlier in the year with those peaks covered in snow, because those peaks are roughly like 5,000 meters high. We're not quite at 4,000 meters above sea level right here, but just imagine that covered in snow. Not mistaken, that over there, that campsite is by Glamp, so the same place that we're staying in Skardu. You can actually stay in Deosai National Park in the summer as well. The altitude, I don't really feel as bad as I did in previous days, like as bad as I did in Babusar Pass, for example, so my head doesn't hurt. I don't feel out of breath unless I'm talking or I'm walking uphill. If I'm walking flat or downhill, I'm fine. And the only thing is that I feel super off balance. Like if you touched me like this, you could knock me down. Regarding the altitude, I had some time to acclimatize during my trip to Pakistan, so this was towards the end of my trip, and I had been to some high altitude places before this, so Babusar Pass and Fairy Meadows, for example, which are both high altitude. So by this point, I kind of knew how altitude affected me. Basically, the conclusion that I reached is that acclimatization matters a lot. So the first high altitude place that I went to was Babusar Pass, and I only got off the car in Babusar Pass. I didn't do any walking, I didn't do anything else. My head hurt a bit, and it didn't hurt too much, but it was very persistent. It lasted for the rest of that day. And my balance was way worse. It was really bad. Like I said, I felt like if you just touched me on the shoulder, I could fall down. I completely lost my balance whenever I was over like 3,500 meters. And by the time I was in Deosai National Park, even though the altitude in Deosai was very similar to the one that I experienced in Babusar, my symptoms were much milder and they were much easier to manage. My balance was a little bit off, but not as bad. And fun fact, I actually thought that the highest altitude that I was in during this entire trip was Babusar Pass at 4,173 meters, but it was actually in Deosai at 4,250 meters. So at even a slightly higher altitude, I felt better because of the acclimatization. Something else I noticed is that from 2,800 meters upwards, that is where my altitude sickness symptoms started. So at 2,800 meters is where I started losing my balance, and I didn't necessarily feel off balance at that altitude, but I would notice that I would bump into things more often, I would trip a lot, that kind of thing. And that is also the altitude where I felt like going up hills was a bit harder. I felt a little bit of a shortness of breath, or talking at the same time as I walked was also a little bit difficult. However, even at high altitudes of 3,500 or 4,000 meters, walking downhill or walking straight, like with no hills at all, was totally fine. I didn't feel any shortness of breath doing that, which I thought was really interesting. At first, I also took altitude sickness medication, but it honestly didn't do anything for me, like nothing at all. So I still had a headache, I still felt off balance, and I still had shortness of breath. Even with the medication, I noticed no differences with and without the medication. So maybe it works for some people, but it definitely didn't work for me, so I stopped taking it. Anyways, at one point during our time in Deosai, we stopped at a place for lunch. So we stopped in this little camp. It was very interesting, and we had biryani for lunch, which was great, with some amazing views. Definitely one of the best lunch spots ever. And we also had chai, of course. Something that I also found very interesting is that at this camp and others, there were lots of UN tents, so tents from UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, and I thought that was very interesting because from what I know, this isn't a place that has a high refugee population. It doesn't really even have a permanent local population, much less a refugee population. And while Deosai National Park is part of Gilgit-Baltistan, which is a disputed territory, it is currently claimed by India. It is not a conflict area. There isn't any conflict anywhere near Deosai National Park, at least that I know of. So I'm really not sure why there would be refugee tents here, or like tents that are donated by the UNHCR. And specifically, all of the tents that I looked at said that they belong to the Chinese division of UNHCR, so they were specifically donated by China. So I'm not sure the reason for all this. If you know, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd be very, very interested, but I thought it was very curious. It definitely stood out to me. After our lunch, we continued on our jeep ride, and on this ride, we basically went from one end of the park to the other. So on the other end of the park, we finished at a place called Sheosar Lake, which is so beautiful. I mean, this lake is just magnificent, and it had more wildflowers than other areas of the park when I was there, so it was really, really beautiful. And then the views in the other direction were just magnificent as well. This was definitely the highlight of Deosai for me. And on our way back to Skardu, we actually got to see a little bit of wildlife, which was what I was hoping for. So it wasn't a bear, but we saw some really cute marmots. Okay, so I'm not sure that you can see well in this low quality video, but that right there, that is a marmot. So we did end up seeing a little bit of wildlife. So this was the end of my time in Deosai. After the cute marmots, we simply went back down to our hotel in Skardu. And this was actually also my last day in Gilgit-Baltistan, which was so sad because I loved this region of Pakistan so much. I have never been to a place this beautiful with such raw and pristine nature and such high altitude mountains. It was a truly one-of-a-kind experience, and I loved every minute of it. But it wasn't my last day in Pakistan, so I still had 2 days left in the country, and I chose to spend them in Lahore, which was a completely different experience for me, especially coming from the calmness of Gilgit-Baltistan and then going into the craziness that is Lahore. It was so interesting. There was so much cultural shock. I had so many thoughts about it. As a European, as a foreigner, it was truly so shocking to me. So if you want to know what surprised me about Lahore, the cultural shocks that I had as a European and as a foreign tourist, and also a little bit about the history of Lahore, because Lahore's history is genuinely so interesting, make sure you subscribe and you watch my vlog next week. I promise that you will not regret it. I'm sure that you're gonna like that video. And if you liked this video, which I hope you did if you're still watching, make sure you like and you leave a comment. I would really, really appreciate it, and I will see you next week.